people live in homes, corporations live in balance sheets. That single sentence, posted by Donald Trump, landed like a hammer in the middle of America's housing crisis. And for a moment, it felt like something fundamental had shifted. Because housing is not just an economic issue. It is psychological. It is emotional. It is the foundation of what Americans still call the American dream. And today, that dream is slipping further out of reach, especially if you are young, renting, or trying to buy your first home. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And in this video, I want to step back from the slogans and look at what is really happening beneath this debate. Why did Wall Street move into single-family homes in the first place? Why does banning institutional investors feel right, but may not change prices the way many expect? And what does this moment tell us about power, markets, and politics in modern America? If this question matters to you or to someone you love, stay with me. And if you value analysis that goes beyond outrage, consider subscribing. Because to understand whether this promise changes anything, we first need to understand the problem it claims to solve. And that begins with how housing became a battleground in the American economy. At the center of this debate is a deceptively simple question. Who is housing for? For decades, Americans assumed the answer was obvious. Homes were places to live, to raise families, to build stability over time. Markets existed, of course, but they were secondary to the social purpose. That assumption no longer holds. Today, housing sits at the intersection of three powerful forces: rising costs of living, growing financial concentration, and deep political anxiety. When prices surge faster than wages, housing stops being a stepping stone and becomes a barrier. When large investors enter the market, homes begin to look less like shelter and more like yield. Trump's proposal speaks directly to this discomfort. It frames the issue not as interest rates or zoning laws, but as a moral imbalance. People competing with corporations for the same front door. But policy slogans often simplify systems that are anything but simple. The real question is not whether institutional investors exist, but why the system made room for them. To answer that, we have to rewind the clock. Because this story did not begin with Trump. It began with a crisis that reshaped American housing itself. To understand how we arrived here, you have to go back to 2008. The financial crisis did not just destroy banks, it shattered households. Millions of Americans lost their homes through foreclosure, leaving entire neighborhoods hollowed out almost overnight. Prices collapsed. Inventory surged. And something unusual happened. Wall Street noticed. For large investors, this was not a housing crisis. It was a buying opportunity. Single-family homes, once too fragmented and inefficient for institutional capital, suddenly became cheap, plentiful, and scalable. Private equity firms began purchasing thousands of houses, converting them into long-term rental assets. This was not ideological. It was structural. Low interest rates made borrowing cheap. Home ownership rates fell. Demand for rentals rose. And technology made it easier to manage dispersed properties at scale. Housing quietly transformed from a local good into a national asset class. Over time, this shift normalized. Investors did not replace homeowners overnight, but they became permanent players, especially in certain markets, especially after each downturn. And that is the key point. What looks today like a moral failure is also the product of economic design. And once systems adapt, reversing them is never as simple as passing a law. That tension sets the stage for the first real rupture. The first rupture did not arrive as a sudden crash. It arrived quietly through rents. As institutional landlords expanded, tenants began noticing patterns, rent increases that felt automatic, fees that were standardized, not negotiated, maintenance decisions made by algorithms, not neighbors. Lawmakers noticed too. Across party lines, frustration grew. Democrats blamed private equity for pushing prices higher. Republicans warned of communities hollowed out by distant ownership. Hearings were held, bills were drafted, and almost all of them went nowhere. Until now, Trump's statement did not come from a housing white paper. It came from a political moment, one shaped by inflation, fatigue, voter anxiety, and a sense that the economy no longer works for ordinary people. Markets reacted instantly. Shares of major property investors dropped, not because the policy was detailed, but because the signal was clear. The political cost of being seen as a corporate landlord had risen. This is where symbolism matters. A proposal does not need to pass to change behavior. Sometimes it only needs to threaten, but symbolism cuts both ways. Because if expectations are raised and outcomes disappoint, trust erodes even faster. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. What is actually driving prices and what is merely visible enough to blame? Behind the headlines, there is a quieter truth. Institutional investors did not create America's housing shortage. They entered a system that was already strained and learned how to operate it efficiently. For years, the US underbuilt homes, zoning laws restricted supply, construction lagged population growth. After 2008, builders became cautious and credit tightened. When demand returned, supply did not. In that environment, prices were bound to rise. Large investors simply adapted faster. They had capital, they had data, they could buy in bulk, renovate quickly, and rent at scale. That gave them visibility and political vulnerability. But here is the mechanism many people miss. When big investors step back, homes do not automatically flow to first-time buyers. They flow to whoever can still compete, often smaller investors, private landlords, or cash buyers. The system reallocates. It rarely transforms. This is why analysts are cautious. Not because they defend Wall Street, but because markets have memory. And systems resist moral corrections unless incentives change. So the question is no longer whether institutional investors should be restrained. It is whether restraint alone can fix a structural imbalance decades in the making. And that uncertainty sets up the second and more dangerous moment of crisis. The second rupture is not about investors. It is about expectations. When leaders promise simple solutions to complex systems, they gamble with public trust. And housing is where that trust is already thinnest. Imagine a ban passes. Headlines celebrate. Markets adjust. But months later, prices remain high. Mortgage rates are still punishing. Inventory is still tight. And the frustration returns sharper than before. This is the danger zone. Because disappointment does not produce nuance. It produces backlash. If institutional buyers exit and mid-sized investors replace them, the structure stays intact while the villain merely changes costume. And voters, sensing that nothing fundamental shifted, begin to suspect that the system itself is untouchable. That is when policy debates harden into resentment. History shows this pattern clearly. When economic pain persists, politics turns more aggressive. Regulations become blunter. Rhetoric escalates, and compromise collapses. This is not a failure of intent. It is a failure of alignment between what policies promise and what systems deliver. And nowhere is that gap felt more personally than by the people living inside these homes. Which brings us to the human center of this story. If you are watching this, housing is not an abstraction to you. It is the rent notice that arrives without warning. It is the down payment that keeps moving further away. It is the feeling that no matter how hard you work, the door never quite opens. You are told to be patient, to wait for the market to cool, to accept that this is just how things are now. But patience is hard when stability feels like a luxury. When politicians talk about investors and institutions, what they're really talking about is your future. Whether you will own a home, whether you can stay in your neighborhood, whether the next generation will have a foothold or start from behind. This is why the language matters. People live in homes, not corporations, resonates because it names a loss of dignity, not just affordability. If this story feels personal, it should. And if you believe housing should serve human lives before financial strategies, make that belief visible. Share this conversation, stay engaged, Demand policies that match reality, not just rhetoric, because understanding the system is the first step toward changing it. And the implications of that system extend far beyond America's borders. What happens in American housing does not stay in America. The US housing market is watched, studied, and often copied around the world. When single-family homes become financial assets here, the model travels to Canada, to Europe, to parts of Asia. Capital learns quickly, so do expectations. At the same time, global investors watch US politics for signals. A proposed ban is not just a domestic policy idea. It is a message about where the political boundary between markets and society might be redrawn. If the US pushes back against financialized housing, others may follow. If it hesitates, the trend hardens. This is the geopolitical layer many miss. Housing is no longer just shelter. It is collateral. It is a store of value in an unstable world. And as global uncertainty rises, capital searches for assets that feel safe, tangible, and scarce. That makes housing uniquely vulnerable, which means the debate unfolding now is not really about Trump or Blackstone or even America alone. It is about whether democracies can still shape markets or whether markets shape the limits of democracy. And that question leads us inevitably to the future. Looking ahead, there are three possible paths, and each tells us something different about how systems respond to pressure. The first is the optimistic scenario. Policymakers move beyond symbolism. A ban on large investors is paired with serious supply reforms. Zoning loosens, construction accelerates. Incentives shift toward long-term ownership, not short-term yield. Prices stabilize not because one actor was removed, but because the system was rebalanced. Housing becomes boring again. And boring in markets is usually good. The second is the middle path. The ban passes or partially passes. Institutional investors adapt, smaller investors step in, prices soften slightly in some markets, stay high in others. Politicians declare progress, voters feel only modest relief. The system absorbs the shock and keeps moving mostly unchanged. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one. Expectations rise, results disappoint, frustration deepens, housing becomes a permanent political weapon, regulations grow harsher but less effective, trust in both markets and government erodes. Which path we take depends on whether we treat housing as a symbol or as a system. And that brings us to the final question. What does this moment really reveal about power, politics, and the promises we make? This debate is not just about who buys homes. It is about who we believe the economy is for. When leaders draw moral lines, people versus corporations, they are responding to something real. A sense that markets have drifted away from human purpose, that efficiency has outpaced empathy, that the American dream has become an investment thesis. But systems do not change because we name villains. They change when incentives shift, supply expands, and politics matches economic reality. Trump's proposal matters not because it guarantees lower prices, but because it signals a growing refusal to accept financialization as inevitable. It reflects a broader demand for boundaries, for limits, for an economy that serves lives, not just returns. The danger is stopping at the gesture. If this moment leads to deeper reform, it could mark a turning point. If it becomes another symbolic battle, disappointment will follow. So the real choice is not about banning investors. It is about whether we're willing to do the harder work that makes housing attainable again. If you want to keep exploring how power, markets, and everyday life collide, stay with me, share this video, join the conversation, because understanding the system is how we begin to change it.